There was in the beginning of previous presentation how many people are doing Scrum, so I'm not asking the question. Instead, I ask a different question. How many of you are doing extreme programming? Nobody's doing extreme programming. You should be doing extreme programming, as in the previous presentation was shown that it contains huge amount of good practices that make you successful. All right, large-scale Scrum. I'm working in a Finnish consulting company called Gosi. I have worked in a software development field since 1995. In 2005, I joined a big company who were doing Scrum, but they have many teams. So I started doing large-scale Scrum from the beginning. Currently, what I do mainly is that I'm a trainer, consultant, giving trainings. I'm a certified Scrum trainer and a certified large-scale Scrum trainer. What is Scrum then? Many of you have probably been to some Scrum trainings since you have done Scrum. So probably this picture is familiar with you. This is the most viewed picture about Scrum. But is it the important thing about Scrum? The events that you do there, the activities, what you do? It's not so important. More important is that Scrum is team-based organization, making teams directly working with customers. And large-scale Scrum is way of moving Scrum of one team Scrum in a bigger organization to work with customers. And how does it do it? Typical organizational structure is something like this, that you have silos there, and then you have a project focusing on customer. Large-scale Scrum moves, and basically also Scrum moves you away from these silos. It moves to your team who is focused on customer. This is important about Scrum, and it's important also in the large-scale Scrum. Also, large-scale Scrum contains a picture that contains all the events, and probably it will be the most referred picture about large-scale Scrum. Here we can see that it's pretty much like Scrum. It's a sprint planning, sprint review and retrospective at the end, and then we have overall retrospective. That's only added event in large-scale Scrum. So that's why comes one large-scale Scrum, this kind of principle. Large-scale Scrum is Scrum. And here we have another view of large-scale Scrum. It contains principles that are driving the thing. It contains then the two frameworks, large-scale Scrum up to 8 teams, and large-scale Scrum huge when you have more than 8 teams. And then it contains 100 guides that you could follow or not follow, but those give you at least some guidance how to get started. And then it contains 600 experiments where you can experiment with your organization and get things moving in a really fast pace. So we could look large-scale Scrum like this. It's basically this framework there in the middle, containing principles, technical excellence. Then it contains the structure, what to do with the management, and how to adopt Scrum. To me, most important thing in large-scale Scrum is the principles behind that. I'm not going to go through them here, but let's walk them through looking at the case study where we were implementing large-scale Scrum, building this kind of device. This is a high-capacity network gateway. Building these kind of things, you know, it's not done by one team. It's typically done by tens of teams. But we started with totally scratch. We didn't have any real hardware. We pretty much haven't any written software. And we decided to do this using Scrum. So you start the development totally with scratch. How do you do then the development? We started basically with 2 teams. So even in the beginning, we used large-scale Scrum. The general advice is to start with 1 team when you start something from scratch, but we wanted to experiment something new, so we started with the 2 teams. We had an opportunity to work with 0 legacy code, so we decided, let's not write any more legacy code. Let's have all the code tested in the unit level, and let's have acceptance tests for all of the end-to-end functionalities. So first steps that you need to do in this scenario is typically form some teams, agree on development practices, agree on architecture, create product backlog, and then start doing. So we had two teams when we started this kind of development. One team was coming from totally waterfall background. They were used to doing this kind of component development. Other team has successfully developed one product using agile principles and practices, pretty much Scrum, and developed one product. We decided that one team has huge domain knowledge, one team has agile knowledge. Should we combine the teams or keep the teams different? We decided, let's experiment of mixing the teams. Meaning that we took the legacy people and the agile people and formed two teams where we have even number of legacy people and even number of agile people. And what we formed there, we formed also this kind of a, feature team instead of component teams. Each team was focused on delivering end-to-end customer value. What to do with the managers that we have in an organization and where to get Scrum Masters. There was nice thing about this that we have two managers, two teams. Of course, let's put the managers as Scrum Masters. This is pretty much solution in all of the things. Later on, I saw that it didn't work at all. Even the managers were offline managers, they were not manager of the people. Then deciding development practices. What programming language used to build this? Because we are on Scratch, you could use whatever language. Languages that were proposed in this level were C++ or C. To all of the surprises, the people decided that let's use C in developing this thing. So we build a high-capacity network gateway. Let's use the simplest tool of building it, language called C. What we also decided to have there in the beginning was continuous integration. How to build the continuous integration when you don't have pretty much any hardware. Probably you need some proto-hardware that at least have a same chipset that the intended device. So we acquired these kind of devices. And what we agreed also in the beginning, no legacy code. Automatic acceptance testing was must. Tool that we decided to use there was Robot Framework with one protocol driver. We focused on also using X-unit testing and having unit testing there. This gave us fast feedback of all of the things that we were doing. So what kind of principles there were in action? Queuing theory basically focused on creating system without any queues, focus on really fast feedback. Whole product focus, both teams were feature teams. They worked together building one whole product. So how does it work then, large-scale Scrum with two teams? What do you need to do? Initial product backlog creation. How do you create initial product backlog architecture? How to do multi-team sprint planning? How to just coordinate during the sprint? How to do the sprint reviews and retrospectives. So a couple of pictures there. Here we can see the workshop that we run with all of the people building the product backlog. How you do it? You use pretty much traditional techniques, use cases, verbs, acronym like functionality, usability, requirements, performance, and then you ask people to write all the possible things that we need to do to build the product. You write them on the index cards, and then you basically discuss, you estimate everything, and then you give the index cards to the product owner. Here is your product backlog. Please prioritize it. This is pretty much how it worked. Of course, we didn't give the index cards to the product owner. We used all of the teams to write them in this kind of Excel in parallel. So it took something like 10 minutes to write 100 of user stories to one product backlog. Initial architecture, best way of writing architecture is using this kind of whiteboards. We ideas having this kind of workshop, all the people interested in what kind of product we are building, let's work around the whiteboards and create architecture. How to do then this kind of a common sprint planning or joint sprint planning, you invite all the people in one big room, teams are doing the planning together. Always when you have some questions, you just go and talk with other people. Then here is a picture of initial team room. The problem with our initial team room was that we distributed them in space. One was in other end of the building, one was in totally different end of the building. It was really hard to coordinate work between teams during the sprints. We pretty much noticed that and moved to totally different kind of team rooms. Here we can see the team sitting there behind a couple of visitor places here where people can visit, who are visiting the site, and behind the wall there was other team. And we could use really advanced coordination technique between the teams. Just scream over the wall if you have something over the other team. And here we have then this kind of a multi-team sprint review meeting. We can see their product owner looking, and here somebody's presenting something. Everybody's interested in what's going on there. Everybody gets feedback, and we have whole product focus. Of course, then there is overall sprint review that we need to do. And this we did in this kind of a little bit smaller auditorium than this, but pretty big. And in the beginning, we have two teams, so they fit nicely there. But of course, when we grew, the auditorium was pretty full in the overall retrospectives. And here we can see two groups working on some impediments, try to solve them. If you know people, you know that the person writing there is the head of the R&D.
How long did it last?
Overall, it was 45 minutes. Overall retrospective. Remarks. Things that happen when you start from scratch with two teams is that those teams argue much. Huge, this kind of a dependency problems between the teams, because you don't have any code, you don't have any architecture. Each of the person have their own view how to build the architecture. One team could agree something, and now we have two teams competing how to build the architecture. The good thing about this was that we pretty much probably explored all the possible options that didn't work in the architecture before we came up with some ideas that work. And don't separate the teams in space, it doesn't make any sense. Multi-team planning works really well when you have this kind of a big room, but it's not enough. During the sprint, arrange huge amount of workshops, so the architecture grows in the way that two teams can agree on that. Create shared space where you have the architecture, and then don't underestimate the technical challenges when you build something from scratch. It was a huge problem even beginning to get anything to compile there in the real platform, and according to that, on top of that, install it somewhere. Also, this kind of planning versus doing balance was hard to find. How much plan, how much code? The traditional people had this kind of idea that everything must be planned. The Agile team has an idea that let's just jump and code something. But there is balance when you start something from scratch. You need some thinking before coding. But it depends on the product that you build, but some balance should be found. Improvements. We had the overall retrospective. Most of the improvements that we raised there were easy to solve. And we have managers there, all the people could solve it. We get huge amount of improvements done. Scrum Masters, they don't work really well as managers. And why they don't work? Is that you have some person working 5 years manager, and then he starts acting as a Scrum Master. And then the team members ask, so manager, tell us what to do. The manager says, no, I'm the Scrum Master, I don't tell you, you figure it out. Yes, you have been 5 years our manager. We know that you want to tell us what to do. So you have these kind of arguments there, and the team never owned the solutions, and then the managers were really frustrated because they didn't want to give you any solutions for the teams. So we pretty fast decided that Scrum Masters must come from the team, and the managers were these kind of free agents doing whatever they like to do, but they are not team members nor Scrum Masters. Principles in action, large-scale Scrum is Scrum. We didn't add anything top of Scrum at this point. Only thing was overall retrospective, and the continuous improvement was working fine because we were striving to build our product faster and faster and get a huge amount of feedback. Growing phase 1. Now, we started adding more teams. We had the initial infrastructure in place, initial tooling, continuous integration was working, so it was easy to add teams in the site. The only problem was that the teams were coming from totally traditional waterfallish background. So there were huge resistance of ways of working, the tooling we have chosen, this kind of things that the two teams had agreed for the other teams. But the teams that were coming from traditional background, they didn't have any clue how to work here, so we decided that let's follow the practices from the two teams. When you have worked here some time, you can then start changing things, when you learn why things are working like this. Never underestimate the resistance of people put to place in organization where they have to start working on the rules that somebody else has set there. Of course, we help the teams, we coach them, show them how to do things. When the new team came, there was always one developer there working with the team and one tester, so they knew how to develop things, how to test things in our new environment. This kind of a multi-team sprint planning 1 and 2 doesn't really work when you have 6 teams in one place. You have too many people there, so we need to split this kind of to 2 separate sections. Also, the product backlog refinement that was described already in the previous presentation doesn't really work when you have something like 30 people in one room and over that. So you need to do something else. This is the picture of this kind of small sprint planning. You do it together, but we have to move on sprint planning using team representatives, meaning that team representatives agree with the product owner what the team is doing. When there is a good product backlog refinement done, it's just basically agreeing which team is doing what, solving dependencies, making sure we work on the most important things if the product owner changed something, and that sprint planning 2 part is then done inside the teams. Each of the team is creating their own sprint backlog, and they work as a normal Scrum team. Of course, there's a possibility if there are lots of dependencies doing this kind of a joint sprint planning that's pictured there. This worked really well. No problems there. Then product backlog refinement with few teams, you do it in one big area, it works nicely, but when you have more than 2 or 3 teams, it doesn't really work, too much people. You need to move the scenario where you have a team representative, basically selecting which of the teams is working on items, and later on you have them specific event where the team is working with the subject matter experts and basically does the refinement. Out of that comes, of course, new items to the product backlog that the product owner has to understand. Somewhere at this point, we introduced highly advanced bug tracking system. It was basically one wall there in a central place, and always when you have some bug, you put it on the wall. It though had limited amount of spaces. If it contained more than 5 bugs, you couldn't put there anymore. You have to fix one defect before that. What remarks there are? Coaching helps, growing was pretty easy, no problems, everything worked fabulously. The resistance was, of course, really a bit annoying. Principles in actions is the systems thinking. We looked at the whole system as one, tried to optimize it whole, get the all teams to work together. Each team is the feature team working on the area. We used empirical process control. Now we have the system in place. We get nicely feedback from all of the changes in code base. All of the major functionality was automatically accepted as tested, huge amount of unit testing and things like that. And that enabled us to create huge amount of transparency. Now comes then the difficult part. You move from large-scale Scrum to large-scale Scrum huge. And why did we need to move there? Was that somebody in our top management of organization has decided that you are going a little bit too slow there in organization, but in India we have a set of teams that could help you to develop software. So please take the teams. If you don't take the teams, you try and take the teams. Pretty much this was the advice from the top management, that you have to work with the teams. So how to get this working is pretty much so that you invite the Indian teams to main site, you teach them how to do work, and then they will go back to India, you send people helping the Indian people there, and you need to have a local product owner representative there also in the India. So this is the LESS framework, works nicely, up to 8 teams. Now you have to move to this kind of framework where you have a little bit more, one extra role and one extra artifact. Meaning that we have area product owners and area product backlogs. We don't add anything more there. So what do you need to do there when you move above 8 teams is to introduce requirement areas. Requirement area is some customer-centric end-to-end functionality that set off the team's work. We formed quite small areas, basically 1 to 2 teams, and each of the area should have area product owners, so we looked on the product management. Yes, there are some product specialists, let's nominate them as the area product owners. The problem was here that they were not real product owners, they were feature experts. Later on, I tell you why it's a problem. So when you move to less huge, you need to add there basically requirement areas, area product owners, and area product backlogs. And basically what it means that each of the area product owner works as a product owner towards their teams. Still, what is important here is that all of the teams, they work in the same sprint. After the sprint comes one product increment, you do the planning together, and basically everything creates transparency. The things that happens also here is that when you have quite many teams, the product owner cannot anymore visit any teams because you tend to have more than 8 teams. Basically, you need to have this kind of a sequential review meetings where the area experts work with the teams and maybe product owner visits shortly between the teams. And then we had the separate sprint review and basically planning for the offsite teams, but they still worked on the same cadence. Observations now. When you split to really small areas, the problem is that you have huge amount of teams, and each of these kind of areas is pretty small one. So each of the area, they don't have the overall retrospective, so there's a huge, this kind of retrospective meeting where you have many teams. The problem is that the improvement ideas that teams raise in this scenario comes really hard to solve. And you have so many people there, it comes really hard meeting. So that's the advice in LESS, that you should form requirement areas that have at least 4 teams, and they would run their own this kind of overall retrospective meetings and own overall reviews where the area product owners really could focus on the teams and focus on improving the areas. Performance testing was always in this step coming a problem because we moved to the real hardware in this state. And testing the real hardware, it needed the real environment, and the performance testing lab was in totally off-site, some other location, and basically we were building new product increments every 2 weeks, but the performance testing could test something in the 2 weeks, pretty much nothing. So they were testing always some old product that we have done, and they find some performance problem, and we said to them, yes, but it was in the old release. We have now working on this current release of the product. So, and influencing the performance testing organization was really hard because it was separate organization off-site. Even we said them go faster, they said, yeah, but we are traditional, we are doing in traditional ways. Luckily, then later on, we find out that there was another team in other location that could do performance testing much, much faster than the closer team to us. Remarks. When you have this kind of a huge amount of teams, huge amount of managers, the job of the management should be to provide improvement service, meaning that in overall retrospective you get this kind of tough improvements to be done. Basically, management job is to put them to the improvement backlog and work together to solve the tough improvements. Training, don't underestimate. When you add more teams, please train all of the people that are participating there. Just coaching them doesn't really help. And what we did with managers when we have huge amount of them, the R&D head of the organization had this kind of idea. So we have this kind of managers in organization. Most of the things that they are doing, they are just helping the teams every now and then, but they have lots of free time. Let's put them in one development team together and make them work towards the product owner, the product backlog, and work as a normal Scrum team. And it worked fabulously. Managers love it. They were really good developers that they were promoted to be managers, so basically they still knew how to develop and test software, so they spent most of their time creating valuable software for the product owner and spent some time in bureaucracy towards the organizational needs. Requirements areas too small that I discuss. And the problem is that when you have real small requirement areas, the product owner doesn't really trust the feature experts to run the areas as a real product owners. So when you move to this kind of organization having requirement areas, focus on having large enough areas and focus on having real area product owners. Total number of teams was more than 20, less than 30. 4 sites at the end of the development. More with less roles. We basically stick with the roles that we have there, that Scrum defines. What we added there was area product owners, nothing more of that. Customer-centric, meaning that we focused on building product increments sprint by sprint that could be delivered to customer. And lean thinking also related to this. At some point there, when we have product pretty much in the shape that the first customers would be soon taking the product, one customer came and visited and see how we developed our product and asked this kind of a tough question from our product owner. So, you have told how do you develop the products, but I don't see how do you track defects. The product owner replied to this that we are not focused on tracking defects. We are focused on fixing the defects. Every time we find some problem, we create an automatic test that verifies that there's a problem, and then we fix the problem and it makes sure that it never appears again when we have a test case against it. The customer was Japanese and he said, excellent, like Toyota production system. Focus on fixing, not reporting. Some conclusions. What did we achieve? After some 2 years of development, we finally had the product in the shape that we could ship the software to the customers with the hardware, and we were able to ship new software every 2-week cycles. And when customer finds some problems because it was not really production quality and the customer had totally different kind of testing environments that we had, we basically could fix the problems every 2-week cycles. And customer was happy the product was growing in the customer environment in their test lab and they could find out how it works. And of course, when you have the customer with the product in the test lab, they start coming up with huge amount of their own requirements, and we could take the requirements in and every 2 weeks release some new functionality to customers. And as a result, our head of our business lines comments are there that he was really happy. During the development, when we have always working software, we could demonstrate that to potential customers and we could win new customer cases. This was unheard in developing this kind of a network gateways in the years when we did it, somewhere in 2010, after 2010, 5 years ago. And still most of these kind of products are developed in this kind of waterfall way. Somewhere in 2011, 2010, we ran this kind of employee feedback survey. How do the employees feel about this? And the survey was done by independent third party, so she was actually interviewing something like 10 to 20 main persons in the organization. And here's the feedback. Basically, the feedback from the employee developers was that this was the only way of doing it, and they won't ever go back to the traditional way of developing software. Challenges was that at some point the teams or developers feel that it was hard to see the whole and know what is the state of the architecture. Conclusion, large-scale Scrum was the only viable option. Basically, we started from scratch, and with 2 teams, nothing else that we could do. Then balance the focus between the process and product development. You need to focus on both. You need to start getting the product increments out, but you need to focus also to build the system that creates the product. Otherwise, one or the other starts failing. Coaching is not enough. For the new teams that we brought in, we gave them a huge amount of coaching, not much formal training. And based on the employee survey feedback, some people didn't understand after 2 years of doing things, they didn't understand what is the reasons why we do things like this. They were happy about it, but they didn't know anything why we are doing things like that. Involve higher management. This was part of a really big organization, and top management didn't have any clue about Agile, Scrum, incremental delivery, and they basically came every now and then, visited, have this kind of outrageous opinions, what should be done and what should be not done, and basically have no clue about anything. And the risk when there is top management not understanding Agile is that even the organization works fabulously, you change a couple of main managers there in an organization, risk is that the organization somehow falls back in traditional ways of working. If you have a chance to get the customers to visit your product development site, it was really interesting to see real customers. And how the product owner handled the situation was that now we have a customer in our site. Every developer who is brave enough and come and see that we actually have living customers, come and discuss with the customer. Most of the developers, they were afraid of seeing the customer, but some came there and actually got the chance of discuss with the customer. Moving from large-scale Scrum to large-scale Scrum is something that you should think of how to do it. It's really big jump, how to create the requirement areas, where to find the area product owners. We didn't succeed on that, but based on experience that I have, you don't have to fail there. I think we have 5 minutes for questions before there is a lunch break. Any questions that prevents us from going to the lunch? Nobody dares to ask anything. Yes?
Maybe you should call them site product owners, because requirement areas and area product owners, I got mixed up. Is it an area as a physical area or area of a product? So that's
Yes. It's not a site, it's a requirement area, a functionality. All right, thank you very much.
Dame i gospodo, još jedan.